and today we're going to be reviewing all the tools I've already reviewed. Nah, just kidding. I'm just doing an update video to let people know what tools are still working, which ones I've sold, and which ones have developed issues, and some minor changes in my opinion on tools. Since I buy all my own tools, I think it's important that people understand that, hey, I'm just like you. I'm looking for a good tool for a particular role or need, and so if something happens with a tool that I've recommended before, I think it's only fair to let people know what my updated opinion on the tool is. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, starting off with the Ryobi RY40470 V&M brushless blower. Overall, this blower has been a good blower, and this is probably the blower we use the most. Unfortunately, it has developed an issue, and that issue has to do with the turbo button. The turbo button is how you get the most out of this blower, and there's a lot of situations where you have to have the turbo in order for this blower to be effective. And unfortunately, the turbo button has pretty much stopped working at this point, meaning that the blower's power has basically been cut in half. I'm planning on opening it up and taking a look at the internals of the switch and to see if there's anything I can do to fix it myself, because I like fixing things myself because I like seeing how things are put together. But at the end of the day, I really think Ryobi needs to change their design when it comes to their blowers. The turbo button needs to go away. It's not a good feature, it's not a good design, and it just is not a good plan. I think they really need to just incorporate all the power into the trigger and then just eat whatever hate comments they get about the battery life later on. But for me personally, I still like the blower. I'm just very disappointed that the turbo button has basically stopped working at this point. Next up, we have the Worktop 4-volt cordless screwdriver. I actually ended up returning this one just because I don't think it's really worth the price that they're asking for it. It has some cool features, but the problem is the cool features didn't exactly work as well as they were supposed to. So at the end of the day, it got returned. And next up, we have the work switch driver. This has been a great little drill, and it's great for working in high places or on jobs where you have to switch in between drilling and driving. It definitely is a unique tool, and it's something that I really hope Works releases a second generation that incorporates some sort of impact function, because that's about the only way I can really see them improving it. So I still enjoy using this tool, and I still think it's a great tool to have. So yeah, moving on. And next up, we have the Ryobi RY401100 40-volt mower. Overall, this has been a great little push mower, and I haven't had any major complaints about it. I haven't used it since the end of last summer, but like I said, at the end of last summer, it had still been doing a great job, so it still gets a pass. Garbage, hated it, don't bother, returned it. And next up, we have the Makia Xmt-03z. Now, this is a decent multi-tool, but I personally don't like using it, and I actually have been trying to sell it, but nobody seems to be interested in it. I really do prefer using my little Ryobi because I like having the trigger, and quite frankly, the Ryobi's way easier to hold, and it has just as much power, and it's lighter. So at the end of the day, this is probably a good professional quality tool, but I end up using my Ryobi more often than this particular tool. And next up, we have the Ryobi P235 wet dry vac. Overall, this is not really that impressive of a wet dry vac, and I really am looking forward to the new 40-volt wet dry vac that Ryobi is going to be releasing, but until that one comes out, this one will have to do. But I still have mine, and I'm still using it occasionally, so yeah. And next up, we have Ryobi's one-handed brushless reciprocating saw. Overall, this has been a great little reciprocating saw, and in my opinion, it's also the best reciprocating saw that Ryobi offers. Now, I ended up accidentally dropping this from a little bit of an elevated height. I was working on a ladder, and it ended up bending the shaft that holds the blade. And when that happened, the tool would still function, but I couldn't release the blade in order to change the blade. So what I ended up having to do was take the tool apart and I used a pair of plumber's wrenches, and I ended up bending the shaft back into the proper alignment, and then the tool worked just fine. So just be careful not to drop it from an elevated height, and you should be fine. It's still a great tool, and I would still recommend it. And next up, we have the Ryobi Psb Dd01. Overall, this is a very lightweight, compact, brushless drill, and it's been great. I don't have any complaints about it, and I use it fairly often. And this is really my go-to drill for most jobs that aren't heavy duty, so at the end of the day, it gets a pass. And next up, we have the Ryobi P235 brushed multi-tool. Overall, this has been a great multi-tool, and I don't have any complaints other than the fact it doesn't have a quick release for the blade. But other than that, it's been a great multi-tool, and I don't really see the need in upgrading to the brushless version because the brushless version doesn't have a trigger, and I have to have a trigger. It's a preference thing, and I'm not going to be upgrading to that. But if you are looking for a cheap multi-tool, this is a great little tool to consider. And next up we have the Ryobi P235V. Now this is the kit drill or the budget drill or just the cheapest half-inch drill that Ryobi offers, and it does a decent job. It's not going to be able to compete against anything in the professional market, but if you don't own a drill, it's not a bad drill to get, simply to have a drill on hand. And next up we have the Makia Xd01. I love this reciprocating saw. This is the best reciprocating saw that I own, and it does a fantastic job. Yes, it is brushed. Would I like to have the brushless version? Yeah, but I'm not going to pay the price that they're asking for the brushless version. This brushed version will blow away anything from Ryobi or Hart or any other budget brand. And in my opinion, this has been just a fantastic reciprocating saw. It has a good battery life even though it's brushed, and I have to say that I would recommend this saw to anybody who is looking for a reciprocating saw. This saw comes highly recommended. And next up we have the Hart Dd01. Overall, this has been a good little vacuum cleaner. I really love the form factor, and this is probably my favorite cordless vacuum that I own. Now, there is an issue with the latches that you will have to address if you do end up purchasing it, but as long as you're aware that you're going to have to modify the latches slightly, I would still highly recommend this vacuum cleaner. And next up we have the Ryobi P235. Overall, I use this as a backup or a loaner tool. I don't end up using it a whole lot, but it's still a decent little tool. And if you can get for under $40, it's not a bad tool to have on hand just as a loaner or as a backup. So it still comes recommended. And next up we have the Ryobi PWV21B. Overall, this has been a good little vacuum, and I've been using it fairly often. I don't really like the storage tank because it bends up too easily, but other than that, it's been working just fine, and I don't have any major complaints about it, so it gets a pass. And next up we have the Hart Psb brushless stick vac. Overall, if you can get this vacuum cleaner for under $200 or hopefully under $150, it's not a bad option. I don't like the dock or the wall mount, and I don't like the fact that it can't stand on its own, but other than those two issues, there really is nothing wrong with it, and it does a good job, so it does come recommended still. And next up we have the Ryobi i150BG 18-volt power source. If you have a lot of Ryobi batteries, I would highly recommend having this on hand. It's super useful and it's come in handy on multiple occasions, especially if you live anywhere where you have power issues or power failures or blackouts. It doesn't provide as much power as I was hoping since it's not a pure sine wave inverter, but it still does a fairly decent job and it's good to have for an emergency, so it still comes recommended. And next up we have the Hart HPHL01B. It's a cheap light for power tool batteries. It's good to have on hand for emergencies and maybe camping, but as for a work light, it's not really all that special, and I wouldn't pay over $10 for it, even though it retails for $20. So yeah, it's okay, but I don't use mine a whole lot. And next up we have the Ryobi P505B. Overall, it's a decent little budget circular saw. I don't use this one a whole lot. I use a Makita most of the time, and quite frankly, this just doesn't have that much interest for me. It's better than nothing, and I would still recommend everybody having a circular saw, but at the end of the day, it's not a tool that I usually reach for, so it still comes recommended, but I wouldn't go out of my way to get one. And next up we have the Ryobi P3105 18-volt soldering iron. This is my go-to soldering iron now, and it does a good job. I don't have to use a soldering iron a whole lot, but when I do, this more than fulfills my needs, and quite frankly, I would recommend it to anybody who is looking for a battery-operated soldering iron. Is it a professional soldering iron? No, but it doesn't need to be. It still does a good job, and it's effective, so it still comes recommended. And next up we have the Ryobi P7131. This is a hand vacuum that is okay, it's decent. It has good suction, more than what I was expecting, but the fact that it has a proprietary opening and it doesn't really have any accessory means it's a very limiting vacuum cleaner. Ryobi is releasing a new version which is going to be far better, and quite frankly, I don't really see the point in even getting this one at a discounted price. So I would highly recommend the new one over this one. And next up we have the Ryobi P460. I still have it. I'm still going to probably sell it. I'm just not a fan of it. I don't really think it's all that special. And at the end of the day, it just isn't a tool that I'm all that interested in owning, which is kind of funny because I really wanted this tool for a long time. So yeah, I'm just not a fan of this tool. So it's going to be going bye-bye. And next up we have the Ryobi RY40701 40-volt 8-inch earth auger. Overall, this has been a great auger, and I really enjoy using it because, let's face it, digging post holes with a manual post hole digger is a pain in the neck. So at the end of the day, I still enjoy using this auger. I haven't had any major issues with it whatsoever, and it still comes recommended to anybody who is looking for an electric auger. And next up we have the Ryobi P235 hand light. It's a hand light. The Heart version's better. It's good to have in an emergency. That's about it. It works and it doesn't have any issues. Moving on. I just did a review on this Jigsaw. I've had it for over a year now and it's done a good job. So I don't really have any major complaints other than the fact that the blower function doesn't appear to work all that great. So yeah, moving on. I've had this for a long time. I just did a review on it last week, so we're moving on. It's still a good tool. And next up we have the Ryobi RY40250 brushed 40 volt whacker, or power head, or whatever else you want to call it. It's a good tool. I ended up selling mine because I needed the money more than I needed the tool, since I have 3 other weed whackers, and really, I didn't really have any complaints when I ended up selling it, so it still comes recommended. I just didn't need mine anymore. So yeah, moving on. Next up we have the Ryobi RY40480 40 volt blower. You know, this is not a bad blower. There's more powerful blowers on the market and there's now a replacement, but this is still a decent blower and I still would recommend it. It does a good job, although I think if you're looking at getting rid of or blowing away wet leaves, it's probably not going to fulfill its duties to the need that you might have, but I would still say that it's worth taking a look at. And next up we have the Ryobi P519. Now my P519 is pretty much a backup reciprocating saw and I don't use it a whole lot. If you do end up needing a reciprocating saw, I would highly recommend looking at the HP one-handed reciprocating saw that I talked about earlier. That one's just a much better reciprocating saw and will give you much better battery life. It's just a better saw. So yeah, moving on. And next up we have the Hart Xph10z. It's not a horrible hand vacuum, but it definitely has an issue with the design when it comes to the filter. If you use the coffee filter trick, it helps improve the performance, but at the end of the day, this just is not that great of a hand vac. And next up we have the Ryobi RY401110 40 volt mower. This has been a decent mower, but I kind of wish I had waited a year before purchasing an electric mower, simply because I believe that this year's mowers are superior to last year's mower, and this is last year's model. So if it was up to me, I'd buy this year's model over last year's model because they have better features and options, to be frank. Next up, we have the Ryobi P235 brushed 18 volt weed whacker. This is more of a backup weed whacker for me. I like having an 18 volt weed whacker on hand so I can use my 18 volt batteries if I have a job somewhere else. So it's a good tool and I use it occasionally and I don't have any major issues with it. So this one still comes recommended as well. Next up we have the Ryobi Ez Clean. As long as you know what an Ez Clean is, it does a decent job and it's still recommendable, although the price it's currently selling at is a little bit ridiculous. I wouldn't necessarily pay $100 for this particular tool, but if you can find it on the sale or at a decent discount, I still would recommend it as long as you know it's not a power washer. Next up we have the Makia Xph10z. You know, I have to be honest here, I've not really used this drill since I shot the video for it. This is just a backup drill and it's not a tool that I reach for very often. I think Makita makes decent products, but in my opinion, I think some of the previous generations of drills were actually superior to this drill. But that's just my own opinion when it comes to this particular tool. So yeah, moving on. And next up we have the Makia Xd01z. Overall, this has been a decent little impact driver. I use my Ryobi impact drivers far more often, and so it's not really a tool that I use all the time, but I do use it occasionally because it is a little bit smaller than some of my Ryobis. So yeah, it still comes recommended. And next up we have the Ryobi P235 brushless impact driver. This is my go-to impact driver. I've been using it for quite a while at this point and it's still one of my favorites. I love the fact that it has 3 different speeds you can choose from and it has quite a bit of power, as well as the full-size magnet and bit holder, which I so love. So at the end of the day, this is my go-to impact driver and I have had 0 issues with it. So this one still comes recommended and you can actually find it at fairly reasonable prices on the internet. So yeah. And next up we have the Ryobi RY40270 power head, or grass trimmer, or whatever else you want to call it. This is a Ryobi's attachment capable brushless model that is not the carbon fiber one. This is just the standard aluminum model or metal model, whatever you want to call it. And overall, I've been perfectly happy with its performance and I haven't had any issues with it whatsoever. I am looking forward to eventually trying it out with some of the attachments that you can buy for these attachment capable trimmers, but until the price of life gets cheaper, which is not going to be happening anytime soon, I'll probably have to hold off on that. But if you are looking for a battery operated 40 volt weed trimmer, this is not a bad one to go with, so it still comes recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.